The locals told him the place was cursed, and now he finally understands why. A struggling veteran inherited a tiny bait shop on a frozen Maine harbor, praying it could be his last chance. But the moment his German shepherd started clawing at the old wooden floorboards, everything changed. Beneath the shop lay a hidden room sealed for generations, and inside it, a secret his family tried desperately to bury. What he discovered that night would rewrite his past, reshape the town's history, and give him a future he never believed he deserved. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Snow drifted across the Portland, Maine bus station in thin, wind-torn sheets. The kind of winter cold that didn't simply cling to the skin, but slipped straight through it, settling into bone and memory, like an old enemy returning for unfinished business. Ethan Miller stood beneath the flickering fluorescent light near a dented vending machine, his breath rising in pale bursts as he adjusted the frayed collar of his faded military jacket. Ethan was 34, but looked older, his square, once handsome face hollowed by sleepless nights, his dark blonde beard grown uneven from neglect, his blue eyes dulled by the weight of too many unspoken thoughts. Once a disciplined Army combat engineer, he now carried himself with a weariness that made his tall frame seem slightly hunched, as if the ghosts of past deployments pressed invisible hands on his shoulders. PTSD had left faint tremors in his fingers, subtle but persistent, like static he could never turn off. Beside him sat Rex, his 5-year-old German shepherd, a large dog with a strong build, thick brown and black fur, intelligent amber eyes, and the posture of a creature who understood far too well when a human was breaking. Rex was loyal, alert, and deeply protective, the kind of dog who watched people the way soldiers watch doorways, always calculating, always ready. Tonight he nudged Ethan's thigh gently, with his cold nose sensing something fragile in his owner's stillness. Ethan's life had been unraveling for years, thread by thread, but tonight felt like the moment he finally admitted he had nothing left to cling to. He had been laid off 2 months earlier after the factory where he worked cut half its staff. Before that, his marriage had collapsed under the strain of his trauma, leaving him without a home, without custody of the daughter he adored, and without any sense of direction. Since then, he had drifted from shelter to shelter, sometimes sleeping behind supermarkets or inside abandoned loading docks when beds were full. Each morning he woke feeling like the world was shrinking around him, closing in one locked door at a time. Rex had been the only constant. Ethan had rescued him during a storm 3 winters ago, finding the young dog tied to a fence behind a warehouse, shivering and starving. But over time he'd realized the truth: Rex had rescued him back. As the wind pushed another swirl of snow across the station, Ethan reached into the chest pocket of his jacket and pulled out the letter. It was creased slightly damp from earlier snowfall and stamped with the name of a small law office on the edge of town. Inside was a brief message typed neatly on firm paper, informing him that his great-aunt Margaret, whom he hadn't spoken to in more than 20 years, had passed away and left behind a small bait shop near the harbor. Margaret Green had been an odd fixture in his childhood memories, a stern, wiry woman with tightly coiled gray hair and sharp eyes, the kind of person who measured affection in chores and early morning lessons about tides and fish migration. Ethan remembered her cottage smelling of salt tea and old rope. She had lived alone, fiercely self-reliant, and she hadn't attended family gatherings after a falling out with Ethan's father decades earlier. Yet there she was, reaching across 20 years of silence, leaving him something. He didn't know what unsettled him more, that she remembered him at all, or that she had chosen him instead of anyone else. Why him? Why a broke, drifting, bitter veteran who hadn't earned much of anything in a long time? He folded the letter again, running a thumb along its edge, It felt like an invitation he didn't deserve. "What do you think, buddy?" he murmured. Rex tilted his head, ears perking up, amber eyes studying the letter as if it might leap up and bite someone. Ethan exhaled a laugh, dry, humorless, but real. "Yeah, me neither." A gust of wind rushed through the station as the automatic doors whooshed open, bringing in a man in a heavy brown parka with a thick beard dusted in snow. The man nodded politely at Ethan, offering a brief smile before heading toward the ticket counter. A simple stranger, tall and broad-shouldered, with tired but kind eyes. Ethan instinctively assessed him, height, build, gait, and old soldier's habit he couldn't turn off. The man seemed harmless, just another weary traveler trying to get through the winter. But Ethan's chest still tightened. Vigilance had been carved into him like bone. He hated that about himself, hated the way his mind always scanned for threats, even when none existed. The loudspeaker crackled, announcing delayed departures in a bored, metallic voice. Portland's winter storms rarely asked for permission to disrupt plans. Ethan looked down at Rex again. The dog stretched his neck, resting his head on Ethan's boot. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried more comfort than any words spoken to him in months. "She left us a bait shop," Ethan said quietly, as if saying it aloud might make it more believable. A bait shop. The absurdity of it tugged the corner of his mouth upward. He'd spent 10 years learning to dismantle explosives and clear IED paths in foreign deserts, skills that had no use in a town of fishermen and tourists buying worms and hooks. Life, it seemed, had a dark sense of humor. A woman's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir. You dropped this." He looked up to see a young woman holding out a small, folded map that must have slipped from his pocket. She was in her mid-20s with auburn hair tucked into a knit beanie, pale freckled skin, and warm brown eyes that suggested genuine concern. She wore a thick forest green puffer coat and carried a heavy duffel covered in airline tags. Everything about her looked soft and approachable. "Thanks," Ethan said, taking the map. His voice sounded rough, unused. "No problem," she replied, giving Rex an admiring glance. "He's beautiful." Her smile was bright but brief. She sensed his discomfort and stepped back without pressing. She was the kind of person raised with enough kindness to recognize boundaries. She left toward the platform, boots crunching lightly on grit and snow. Ethan watched her go, wondering when casual conversations with strangers had begun to feel like foreign language exercises. He opened the map. It was hand-drawn, inked with careful strokes, marking the street where the bait shop stood, Harbor Bait and Tackle, next to a coffee shop he vaguely remembered. He traced the coastline drawn along one side. Something in his chest shifted: fear, nostalgia, longing, maybe all three tangled together. He remembered visiting Aunt Margaret's shop as a child, how she spoke to him about tides and storms as if they were old friends. She had been a lean woman with a stiff back, sharp jawline, and hands calloused from rope and net repair. A woman both kind and cold, offering cookies one moment and lectures about responsibility the next. His father always called her stubborn as a barnacle, which, coming from him, meant she was probably just honest. And now she was gone, leaving him the last fragment of her world. The snow thickened outside. The wind grew sharper, funneling through the cracked rubber seals of the bus station doors. Ethan knew he couldn't delay the decision any longer. He had nowhere else to go, nothing else pulling him forward, except the faint hope wrapped inside that letter. He crouched beside Rex. "We're going," he whispered. Rex thumped his tail once against the floor in solemn agreement. It wasn't excitement. It was loyalty, a quiet acceptance that wherever Ethan went he would follow. And suddenly, that was enough. Ethan stood gripping the strap of his worn backpack, the map folded in his pocket, the letter pressed close to his chest like a lifeline. Outside, the winter night was brutal, unforgiving, determined to break anyone who dared to stand still. But for the first time in months, Ethan wasn't planning to stand still. He pushed open the station doors, cold instantly burning his cheeks, and started walking into the swirling snow with Rex at his side. He didn't know what waited at the bait shop, whether it would be salvation, disappointment, or another dead end. But he knew this: he had reached the bottom, and sometimes the only way to climb out was to take the first impossible step. And so, with the wind at his back and a letter guiding his path, Ethan stepped into the night, unaware that the real story was only just beginning. Morning settled over Portland, beneath a thick veil of gray, the kind of winter mist that blurred the horizon and made every sound feel muffled, as if the whole harbor were holding its breath. Ethan Miller walked with slow, measured steps along the icy boardwalk, Rex trotting faithfully at his side, the German shepherd's paws making soft, crunching noises in the dirty snow pushed aside by the wind. Ethan's tall frame hunched slightly forward, not just against the cold, but from the weight of uncertainty that clung to him like a second jacket. The smell of brine drifted across the harbor, mixed with the faint odor of diesel from the motionless fishing boats moored nearby. Most boats looked exhausted, paint-peeling nets hanging heavy and frozen where they draped over the rails. A few fishermen early risers with weather-beaten faces, thick jackets, and knitted caps nodded to Ethan as he passed. They were polite but distant, the kind of men shaped by years of hard weather and harder work. One of them, a stocky, middle-aged man with a deep-set frown and a salt-and-pepper beard, lifted his hand in a brief greeting. From the man's stiff posture and narrowed, suspicious eyes, Ethan guessed he wasn't one for strangers, especially not strangers with out-of-state weariness written all over them. Rex eyed the fisherman for a moment, before returning his attention to the cobblestone's nose twitching diligently, as if cataloging every cent of the harbor. The dog's confidence calmed Ethan slightly. Rex always seemed to know which people could be trusted and which ones should be avoided. Ethan wished he had such clarity. As they turned the final corner of the pier, the bait shop appeared, an aging wooden building, crouched between a boarded-up souvenir store and a dingy laundromat that hummed weakly even in the cold. The sign above it read, "Harbor Bait and Tackle," the letters peeling, as if even the paint had grown tired of winter. Frost clung to the edges of the windows, making the interior look like a frozen diorama trapped in a glass box. Ethan approached it slowly, each step echoing the strange mixture of dread and anticipation gathering in his chest. He ran a hand over his beard, feeling the coarse roughness beneath his gloved fingers. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, the shop's derelict appearance, or the quiet possibility that this place might actually expect something from him. He placed a hand on the doorframe, feeling the roughness of sun-bleached wood beneath his palm, and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned like they hadn't moved in months. Inside, the air was cold, but thick with familiar scents: salt machine oil, old rope, and something faintly metallic, like the memories of fishing hooks long forgotten. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light, seeping through the fogged windows. Rex paced around the room in excited circles, his claws tapping lightly against the weathered floorboards as he sniffed the corners with a detective's diligence. When he sneezed abruptly, sending a puff of dust scattering, Ethan let out a quiet laugh. A small, startled feeling flickered inside him. It was the first time he had heard himself laugh in weeks, maybe months. He surveyed the interior slowly. Shelves were lined with rusted lures, chipped bobbers, and rows of brittle fishing line spools. A heavy wooden counter stood beneath the front window, the varnish worn thin by decades of hands counting bait and coins. A faded calendar from 4 years ago still hung crookedly on the back wall, frozen in time and abandoned like everything else here. Ethan couldn't help but imagine his Aunt Margaret in this very space, a stern, angular woman with narrow shoulders, stern gray eyes, and lips that rarely turned upward. He pictured her counting coins, berating customers for tracking sand inside, or fixing nets with her rope-worn fingers. She had lived here the way she lived everything, with quiet stubbornness and a sense of purpose that didn't need explaining. A sudden tap on the doorframe pulled Ethan from his thoughts. He turned to see a woman standing just outside, a short, round-faced woman in her late 50s with curly white blonde hair, tucked beneath a red knitted hat. Her cheeks were rosy from the cold, and her brown eyes sparkled with curiosity and a warmth that contrasted sharply with the winter air. She held a paper cup in each hand, steam curling up into the gray morning. "Thought you might want something hot," she said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Her voice carried the lively cadence of someone used to talking with customers all day, cold enough to freeze a thought halfway through thinking it. She handed Ethan one of the cups. "I'm Mary Collins. I run the coffee shop up the way, Collins Cafe, Little Blue Awning. I knew your aunt. Not well enough to gossip about her, but enough to say she was one hell of a hard woman." Ethan accepted the drink, nodding in thanks. "Ethan Miller," he said softly, the name feeling oddly foreign on his tongue. "She left me this place." Mary's eyebrows rose. "So you're the nephew." "Well, that explains the dog. Margaret always said she trusted people who kept dogs more than people who didn't." Her gaze dropped to Rex, who had stopped sniffing the shelves long enough to assess their visitor. Mary bent down with a small grunt, extending her hand carefully. "And who's this handsome boy?" Rex sniffed her finger's tail, giving a cautious wag. Approval granted. Mary beamed. "I'll tell you this, Ethan," she continued, straightening up with some effort. "You picked the worst time of the year to take on a project like this. Winter in Portland's a test only the stubborn stay." She paused, studying him with a perceptiveness that made him uneasy. "But you look stubborn enough." Ethan managed a thin smile. "Maybe. Or just lost enough to try anything." Mary nodded knowingly. "Well, if you need help, or if you get cold enough to forget your own name, my door's open. Folks around here might look rougher than they are. Just don't expect anyone to hand you things. Waterfront people make you earn the right to stay." After she left, closing the door with a small wave, Ethan felt the shop settle into a deep stillness again. He stood in the middle of the room, the warm cup in his hands, thawing a little of the tension in his chest. He felt as though the walls held memories, expectations, and maybe even warnings. Rex nudged his hip gently, as if reminding him that standing still was not an option. He took another long look around the chipped paint, the heavy counter, the shelves sagging under the weight of time. It was overwhelming and humbling all at once. But under the exhaustion, under the cold and fear, there was the faintest spark of something he hadn't felt in years' possibility. He knelt down and stroked Rex's head. "Well, buddy," he whispered. "I guess this is home now." Rex leaned into his touch, warm and steady, a silent agreement between two wanderers who had finally found something worth staying for. And with that small moment of fragile hope, Ethan stood up, ready to explore whatever secrets the old bait shop was still keeping. Night fell over the harbor like a heavy curtain, the wind threading itself through every crack in the old bait shop, making the windows rattle softly, as if the building were trying to breathe through the cold. Ethan Miller lay inside his thin sleeping bag, spread across the uneven wooden planks, the faint smell of salt and dust rising with every shift of his weight. Rex curled tightly against his left side, the 5-year-old German shepherd's warm body pressed close, head resting protectively across Ethan's boots. Outside, the street lamp cast a dim, pale yellow glow through the frost-streaked glass, turning the interior into a patchwork of moving shadows whenever the wind nudged the door or scraped branches against the siding. Ethan stared up at the exposed beams above him, counting knots in the wood, as if each one could anchor his drifting thoughts. But the past always knew how to slip through, especially at night. Without warning, the distant howl of the wind morphed into the memory of helicopter blades fast chopping the sound, vibrating through his chest, as it once did in the desert. Then came the booming echo of explosions, shouts layered over the chaotic blur of sand and smoke. His breathing hitched, pulse spiking, and he squeezed his eyes shut. Rex sensed it before Ethan did. The dog lifted his head, ears twitching, and nudged Ethan's chest with a soft, insistent whine. Ethan exhaled shakily, grounding himself by threading his fingers through Rex's thick fur. "I'm here," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the dog or begging his own mind to return. It took several minutes before the nightmare slipped back into the shadows, leaving only the quiet creak of the shop and the distant crash of waves against frozen docks. When dawn finally slipped into the room, it arrived gray and slow, as if even the sun hesitated to wake Portland in winter. Ethan forced himself upright, rubbing a hand across his beard, feeling the stiffness in his spine settle into something manageable. Rex shook out his fur, stretching with a soft huff, before trotting to the back of the shop. Ethan began clearing clutter, half-rotten crates, tangled fishing line jars filled with rusted hooks. Every object felt like a relic of a life he barely understood, yet he handled each one with an odd sense of duty, as if his aunt might be judging him from whatever cold afterlife she now occupied. Around mid-morning, as he lifted an old oil heater, a round, dented metal thing that smelled faintly of kerosene, Rex suddenly froze. The dog's muscles tightened beneath his coat tail, stiffening straight back, head lowering with sharp focus. Ethan recognized that posture immediately. It was the same stance Rex took when detecting something wrong in alleyways or abandoned loading docks during their rougher months. "What is it?" Ethan murmured, stepping beside him. Rex responded by scraping one paw against the floor in quick, determined strokes. The claws hit wood with rhythmic taps, each one sharper than the last. Ethan frowned. "Buddy, there's no bomb here. This is a fishing shop, not Kandahar." He meant it as a joke. His dry humor was rusty, but still intact, but the unease in his voice betrayed him. Rex ignored the comment and kept clawing faster now, as if something beneath the floor demanded urgent attention. Ethan knelt and pressed his palm flat against the wood. It felt slightly uneven, colder than the surrounding planks. He gave a small knock, expecting the dull thud of solid flooring. Instead, the sound came back hollow, a soft, empty echo that had no business existing in a one-story shack. Ethan blinked, leaned in, knocked again. Hollow. The exact same hollow he'd heard weeks before when a shelter volunteer handed him a rotten fruit crate and muttered, "Careful, bottom's missing." He felt a slow unwinding in his gut. Not fear exactly, but something close to anticipation tinged with warning. "You're kidding me," he whispered, more to the house than to the dog. He brushed aside dust and debris, exposing the edges of the plank. It didn't match the others perfectly. The nails were slightly crooked, and the wood grain seemed lighter, newer. Someone had replaced it, possibly not that long ago, maybe even after the shop had closed. Ethan reached for a small flathead screwdriver he'd found earlier in a drawer, its handle cracked and faded from years of use. He wedged the metal tip under the plank. Rex watched anxiously, pacing in tight circles. Ethan braced himself and pried upward. At first the board didn't budge, refusing to give up its secret. Then, with a soft groan, it lifted half an inch. Cold, stale air rushed upward, carrying a faint smell, dust-old wood, something metallic and the slightest trace of oil. It wasn't the rotten dampness of mold or forgotten food. It was deliberate, preserved, hidden. Ethan slid the plank aside fully, Beneath it yawned a narrow gap about 3 feet deep, a crawl space between the floor and the frozen ground below. The darkness inside seemed to pulse, swallowing the beam of daylight that filtered through the window. Rex lowered his head and sniffed, letting out a low rumble that vibrated in his throat. Not aggression. Recognition. Ethan grabbed his flashlight from his backpack. The old Army-issued one scratched along the sides, still functional despite years of neglect. He clicked it on and aimed the beam downward. The light illuminated a messy tangle of bundled tarps, a few rusted metal rods, and an overturned milk crate. But behind it, partially concealed beneath a sheet of burlap, sat a rectangular shape too clean, too sharp-edged to be accidental. A box. Not big, but heavy-looking. Metal corners, reinforced frame, the kind of box someone built to protect whatever lived inside. Ethan's breath tightened. Aunt Margaret hadn't been the sentimental type. If she hid something, it wasn't a love letter. He felt the back of his neck prickle. Memories stirred, the way his father used to mutter that Margaret kept secrets, the way sailors keep rum, hidden and dangerous. He lowered himself carefully into the crawl-space boots, scraping against cold earth. Rex hovered above, pacing along the opening, as if guarding the perimeter. The confined space pressed in on Ethan, awakening a flicker of claustrophobic tension, rooted in a collapsed trench overseas, where he once had to dig his way out with bleeding hands. He shut his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. Cold dirt. Dust. Rex's worried breathing above him. Present, not past. He crawled forward and placed his hands on the box. The metal was icy, the surface slightly dented, as if someone had dropped it years ago. He brushed away a thin layer of grime and found a small latch secured by a rusted combination lock. A faint engraving marked the lid, M.G. Margaret Green. A rush of conflicting emotions washed over him, bitterness, sorrow, curiosity, fear. Why hide a locked box beneath the floorboards? What did she expect him to find? What did she want him to do with it? He pushed the box toward the opening, muscles straining with the effort. Once it was near the edge, he climbed out, pulling it up beside him. The weight settled on the wooden planks with a low thud. Ethan sat back, Rex immediately sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. Snow drifted gently outside, visible through the frost-patched window. A boat horn echoed faintly across the harbor, long and mournful. Ethan felt the world around him tighten into a quiet circle of anticipation. He placed his fingers on the cold lock. It felt wrong to open it. It felt wrong not to. He exhaled slowly, murmuring to Rex, "Whatever this is, it's been waiting a long time." And though the box remained unopened by the end of that morning, Ethan understood one thing with absolute clarity: whatever life his aunt had lived, whatever battles she had fought long before his own, she hadn't left him this shop out of nostalgia. She left him a puzzle, a message, a door. And the first crack in that door had now been pried open. The cold tightened its grip on the harbor that afternoon, the light outside dimming into a bluish haze that seeped through the bait shop windows, turning every shadow into a darker shade of uncertainty. Ethan Miller stood above the newly uncovered opening in the floor, gripping the edge of the hatch with calloused fingers. His breath escaped in small, controlled streams, the kind a man makes when trying to steady his nerves. Rex positioned himself at Ethan's hip, tail, stiff amber eyes fixed on the dark gap below, as though guarding a doorway into another life. The air rising from the opening was colder than the shop itself, carrying with it the scent of old timber dust and something subtle like pages untouched for years. It felt less like a hole in the floor, and more like a pause in time waiting for him to step into it. Ethan clicked on his flashlight, the familiar metal casing solid in his hand. He descended one shaky wooden step at a time, the narrow staircase groaning beneath his weight. The walls were close, rough wooden planks, darkened with age, and each breath he drew stirred tiny particles of dust that danced lazily in the beam of his light. Rex followed close behind, paws landing softly, his body tense but unafraid, the way only a loyal animal could be when navigating the unknown alongside someone he trusted completely. At the base of the stairs, the cellar opened into a surprisingly spacious room. Not tall, the ceiling brushed the top of Ethan's hair when he stood straight but long and meticulously arranged. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each one filled with documents stored in metal boxes or tied bundles. Wooden crates sat stacked in neat rows, labeled carefully in Margaret's cramped handwriting. Ethan aimed the flashlight across the shelves and read the labels one by one: boat repairs, 1994 to 2001 harbor fees, fishing permits, emergency rations, savings, ledger, Ethan fund. That last one made him freeze. He swallowed hard. Ethan fund, he whispered. His voice echoed faintly off the wooden planks, soft but undeniably real. Rex tilted his head as if urging him forward. A small wooden table stood at the center of the cellar legs, carved with decorative swirls Ethan never knew his aunt had the patience for. On top of it sat a thick envelope, pale yellow, addressed in a shaky yet unmistakable script, to Ethan. The handwriting was old, as fragile-looking as cracked frost. Ethan hesitated before reaching for it, the paper strangely warm from absorbing the cellar's stillness over the years. His hand trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal, a simple circle pressed with the imprint of a tiny anchor, Margaret's old emblem from the days she sold handmade fishing charms to tourists. Inside were several documents. The first was a small savings passbook from a local bank. Ethan flipped it open and felt his chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with disbelief. The numbers weren't enormous, but they were steady, built over decades. Margaret had saved anywhere she could cash deposits from bait sales, odd repair jobs she did for boatmen, and notes about small winnings from some local raffle he'd never heard of. She had kept a ledger of every dollar earned, every penny tucked away. Another document revealed stock certificates, nothing glamorous, but belonging to a shipping and logistics company headquartered a few towns away. It wasn't the kind of corporation that made people rich, but the shares had clearly grown over time. Then came the most surprising paper, a foundation document titled Veteran Relief Microfund, in Ethan Miller's name. Ethan stared at it, feeling the weight of something he'd never expected someone planning for his future without asking him, needing him, or judging him. Margaret had been notorious for her brusque manner and sharp tongue. She was the type of woman who'd tell a grieving fisherman to stop crying and fix the damn net. Yet in this cellar, surrounded by boxes of meticulously labeled intentions, Ethan saw her differently. Beneath her hard exterior had lived a quiet, stubborn devotion. Rex wandered to the side of the room and caught sight of an old wooden lure carved into the shape of a herring. He picked it up gently between his teeth and shook his head, the lure rattling softly. Ethan let out a wet laugh that startled even him. Tears stung the corners of his eyes, not heavy, just enough to reveal how thin the barrier inside him had become. "I don't understand," Ethan murmured, sitting down on a low crate. His knees bent with a soft crack and he leaned forward, elbows on thighs, staring at the envelope's contents. "Why me, Rex? Why would she do all this for me?" He thought back to childhood, the only memory that wasn't stained by conflict. He had visited Margaret's shop twice. Once at age 5, once at 9. He had written her Christmas cards every year after that. Sometimes she replied with a short note, sometimes not. But she always sent him a tiny carved lure in return. Ethan's father had eventually thrown most of them away, dismissing them as sentimental junk. But Ethan had salvaged a few, hiding them under loose floorboards in his bedroom until he left for the army. He wondered now if she'd known he kept them, if that had mattered. His fingers brushed the letter again, noticing a folded page tucked deeper inside. He opened it with care. The letter was written entirely in Margaret's hand, angular strokes, fierce in their determination, even with age's tremor. Ethan. If you're reading this, then the house has chosen to let you in. I won't apologize for the distance in our family. Some people break things without meaning to others break things because they don't know better. I tried to keep out of it. But you were the only one who remembered me with kindness. Every Christmas card, every drawing you sent as a child, they reminded me that goodness can appear even in families that forget how to love. I saved what I could for you. It is not much by this world's standards, but it is enough to start over. You deserve that chance more than anyone. Build something with it. Something honest. Something softer than the life I lived. Margaret Green. Ethan's throat tightened. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, not ashamed of the tears that finally gathered and slipped freely. Rex nudged his knee and rested his head against Ethan's lap. Ethan stroked the thick fur, automatically grounding himself. The cellar felt warmer now, not physically, but in that strange way where meaning filled the air like breath. He looked around at all the labeled crates, the numbers, the careful organization of a woman who had lived quietly, saved quietly, and loved quietly. Her love wasn't soft or spoken or adorned with ribbons. It was carved into ledgers and hidden beneath floorboards, recorded in boxes labeled Ethan Fund, left in trust for a boy who had been kind to her once. Ethan gathered the documents and tucked them back into the envelope. When he climbed up the stairs, Rex bounding ahead, the shop's interior felt different, still old, still falling apart, but somehow more alive. As he stepped onto the main floor, he looked around with new eyes. The dusty shelves weren't burdens, they were beginnings. The rotting counter wasn't an obstacle. It was a promise waiting to be rebuilt. His aunt hadn't made him rich, but she'd done something far more valuable. She'd handed him the first real chance he'd had in years. And for the first time since he left the army, the future didn't look like a cliff. It looked like a path. A hard one, maybe narrow, but undeniably his. Winter lingered over Portland in a stubborn, icy hush, the kind that crusted the harbor's railings with frost and turned every exhale into a ghost toast drifting through the air. But the sidewalk in front of Ethan Miller's newly restored shop, now proudly bearing the hand-painted sign, Harbor Second Chance, remained miraculously clear. Every morning before sunrise, Ethan swept away the night's snowfall with slow, steady strokes, his tall frame bundled in a thick navy coat, his breath sending soft clouds into the dim light. Rex patrolled behind him, the 5-year-old German shepherd's fur thickened by winter, his amber eyes bright and alert, as he sniffed at every passing breeze like a self-appointed guardian of the street. The shop was different now, alive in a way Ethan never expected. Months had passed since he first opened the hidden cellar and read Margaret's letter, and those months had reshaped the man as much as the wood and paint reshaped the building. Gone was the hollow-eyed drifter who'd arrived out of desperation. In his place stood someone steadier, broader in the shoulders, his once unkempt blonde beard trimmed neatly, his face less shadowed by inward storms. His posture no longer slumped under invisible weight. He carried himself like someone who finally had a place to anchor his days. Inside the shop breathed warmth. The old splintered counter had been sanded and refinished, the shelves restocked with bait jars, tackle boxes, small souvenirs crafted from driftwood, and a modest but steady supply of hot coffee that had become surprisingly popular among fishermen. The scent of roasted beans mingled with salt air, and the new pine boards Ethan used during renovations, a combination that made customers say the shop smelled like hope, seasoned with ocean. It wasn't perfect, The heater buzzed too loudly. One window still whistled during storms, but it was a sanctuary for more than just Ethan and Rex. By mid-morning, a handful of regulars trickled in. There was Tom Delaney, a retired fisherman in his late 60s, with a wiry build and a face carved by decades of wind. His white beard was trimmed short, his skin the deep weathered tan of a man who'd spent his life under open skies. Tom was gruff, had a limp from a boat accident decades earlier, and rarely smiled, but he always slipped Rex a biscuit when he thought Ethan wasn't looking. There was also Sharon Whitcomb, a tall woman in her early 40s, long henna-red hair, braided down her back freckles, across her pale nose, and a sharp wit that made her a local favorite. She worked part-time at a marine supply store and often stopped by wearing a faded green jacket and carrying a canvas bag filled with rope paint samples or whatever project she was tinkering with. Her personality was brisk but warm, someone who carried herself with confidence, yet softened noticeably whenever Rex bumped her hand seeking a scratch. Sharon had once survived a severe winter storm out at sea, leaving her fiercely protective of others during the cold months. And then there were the men Ethan quietly supported, the veterans who wandered Maine's coast, looking for something resembling solid ground. One of them, Caleb Foster, became a familiar evening presence. Caleb was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair shaved close on the sides, his jaw marked by a thick stubble that hinted at unhealed tiredness. His brown eyes held the haunted softness of someone who'd seen too much, but still tried to remain gentle. He wore a heavy charcoal coat missing a button and carried everything he owned in a pack that sagged from years of overuse. Ethan learned Caleb had served in the Marines, had lost 2 close friends in an ambush in Helmand, and had never fully found his footing afterward. Caleb wasn't a talker, but he listened, and when he did speak, it was with a quiet sincerity that made the other veterans nod with familiarity. He always asked permission before petting Rex, a small courtesy that revealed the depth of respect he carried inside. Harbor, Second Chance, had become their gathering place, a warm spot in a cold city, a refuge for people who needed somewhere to land, even briefly. Ethan used part of the inheritance stocks to set up a discreet fund, small cash grants, job prep kits, and connections with local businesses willing to hire veterans. He hosted evening storytelling sessions, a simple circle of mismatched chairs near the heater where Cuban fishermen or the occasional drifter could share memories or simply sit in silence without judgment. The rule was clear: you leave your burdens at the door or you carry them together inside. At night, the shop transformed again. After closing time, Ethan rolled out a thick tarp in the back corner where he placed spare blankets, a heater, and donated dog beds. People without a home but with a dog found a haven here, those who usually got turned away from shelters because of their 4-legged companions. There was Gina, a petite woman in her 30s with short, spiky black hair, pale skin, and tattoos snaking up both arms. Her life had fallen apart after losing her housing due to medical bills. Her dog Milo, a scruffy tan mutt with mismatched ears and a tail that wagged like it belonged to a much larger dog, shadowed her everywhere she went. Milo adored Rex, following him like an eager little brother. There was also Paulie, a lanky young man with sandy blonde curls and nervous blue eyes, probably no older than 20. His clothing hung from him awkwardly, and his hands always shook slightly, not from substances Ethan suspected, but from fear and hunger. Paulie carried a small tabby cat wrapped in a worn blanket. The cat, named Socks for his white paws, was skittish, but calm whenever Paulie held him. Paulie spoke softly, almost apologetically, but he always thanked Ethan with earnest sincerity. And Rex, loyal, proud Rex, became their guardian. Every night he walked slow patrols between sleeping bags, checking the door, then circling back to curl beside Ethan, as if assuring himself that his human was still safe in this strange, expanding family. His behavior shifted subtly over months. He grew more confident, more playful, occasionally stealing biscuits or napping on the couch Sharon donated. Even Tom once muttered, "That dog runs this place better than you do," a rare spark of humor from the grizzled fisherman. One evening, after cleaning up spilled coffee and sweeping salt from the floor, Ethan paused at the doorway and watched his small community settle in. Caleb sat near the heater rubbing Rex's ears. Gina mended one of Milo's blankets with bright blue thread. Polly nibbled on a hot sandwich Sharon had brought earlier. Outside, snow twisted in the street lamp's dim glow like white smoke rising from the earth. Ethan steadied himself against the counter, eyes warming with a softness he hadn't felt in years. Everything in this shop, the warmth, the laughter, the strange, mismatched family had grown from the quiet legacy his aunt left hidden beneath the floor. Not gold, not treasure, but a chance. And he had taken it. He had built something softer, just as she asked. He glanced at Rex, who stared back as if understanding everything. Of course he did. Rex always understood. "Good job today," Ethan murmured. Rex thumped his tail, proud and content. And as another storm rolled in across the blackened sea harbor, Second Chance glowed like a lantern in the dark. A reminder that even broken people could become light for others. In the end, Ethan's story is a quiet reminder that miracles rarely arrive with thunder or shining angels. Sometimes God works through small, ordinary things. An old letter hidden beneath a floorboard, a loyal dog who refuses to give up, or a stranger who shows kindness at the exact moment you need it. These small mercies may seem simple, but they are often the threads he uses to stitch a broken life back together. What happened at Harbor Second Chance wasn't about wealth or luck. It was about grace. About the way God can guide a weary soul toward a place where healing can begin. And just like Ethan, all of us walk through seasons of cold, through winters of the heart, where we feel forgotten. Yet even then, God places people, moments, and opportunities along our path to remind us we are never walking alone. If this story touched you, if it made you feel even a spark of warmth or hope, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can find the hearts that need them most. May God bless you, keep you safe, and surround you with quiet miracles in your everyday life. And may He guide all of us, just as He guided Ethan toward second chances we never knew were waiting.